Well, Kim Stanley Robinson, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thanks, Ty. Good to be with you.
I absolutely loved reading The Ministry for the Future because you really do such an excellent job of exploring the economics and the policy making that has caused the climate crisis and what it would take to reverse this damage that we've already done and will continue to do to the planet. Reading this book, though, I felt like I was reading political science fiction rather than, your traditional science fiction. What interests you about exploring how the climate crisis may play out from a political and economic perspective?
Well, I think it's the crucial element. And I think of science itself, or science, technology, engineering, mathematics, medicine, all those things are political. They are social acts that are organized under a set of laws and regulations. So to a certain extent, it's a false distinction that we make. And it's good to think of your computer that to on the one hand, it's a bunch of metal and plastic and circuits and microprocessors. On the other hand, it's software and connectivity and a social compact, social media, as they call it. So hardware, software, it's all like that. And it's very important that some science fiction pays attention to the software of society at large. So there you have a political economy. And it's one of the great speculative elements of science fiction. And this goes right back to Utopia, Thomas More. These earlier manifestations of the genre, they were also science fiction before we had the name science fiction, and before we were so fixated on the hardware part of technologies, the quick growth of powers that we have in the world because of these scientific slash technological successes, but they've also been political successes. So all that's tied up, and this is really where the novel comes in. The novel is good at trying to show how it all ties up into one larger story.
Well, I think the Ministry for the Future, it seemed to me anyways, like an indictment of the neoliberalism that has become really the dominant economic philosophy in America and so many Western countries since the 1980s, late 70s, 80s, which just happens to coincide with your career as a novelist. And I'd love to know, as your career has progressed and there has been more and more deregulatory efforts that have just caused even worsening inequality, how has this rise and this takeover of neoliberalism influenced your writing, and has that changed at all?
Well, it's I'm glad that you asked that, because it's a way of thinking back on my career. So, okay, I was trained my undergraduate years were in the 70s, and my graduate years. So think of me as a kind of Vietnam era hippie Buddhist California backpacker, but trained in a leftist tradition. I'm an American leftist. And my advisor was Frederick Jameson. My context in the 70s was hard left. And really it felt like it wasn't me doing a whole lot of analysis. It was the water that I swam in.
Mhm.
So I was part of a movement, and it all seemed obvious. So it took a long time to understand that 1980, the Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution, was a big deal. It was confusing for most of the 80s. So it took a long time to pull it together. People talked about globalization or deregulation. The Reagan slogan that government is not the solution, government is the problem. The Thatcher slogan, there is no alternative and there's no such thing as society. These, it took, well, I would say it had to string along for the whole 20 years, and you get to globalization, you get to first talk of neoliberal capitalism. It isn't as if it was obvious when it began. And indeed, you have to do some kind of historical back work, like where did these people get their ideas? Because Thatcher and Reagan were not geniuses, and few of us are. They didn't make up these ideas; they seized them. So now people are looking back at the Mount Pelerin Society, the kind of neoliberal think tank that put the ideas out there. And Milton Friedman was very articulate on this. The politicians don't have ideas. When they come to a crisis, they're going to pick up the ideas at hand. We're going to put the ideas there that it's going to come to their hand. And you get a crisis, which they called stagflation. In the late 70s, they had both high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. And it began to look as if Keynesian economics that had ruled the world since 32 at least, and really almost since, well, it took till the 30s and the New Deal and the whole response to the Great Depression, that had been working, and then it got dismantled because it briefly looked like it wasn't working. Well, this was the most uh, it was a judgment on stagflation that also was a power play. So if power was being more and more democratized and spread out amongst the people, and the what we call the 1%, but the elite, the richest people on the planet were losing their grip on the political world, to grab it back, they could use these pseudo ideas, which were neoliberal economic ideas. So, okay, trying to write about that. I mean, in my Mars trilogy in the 90s, you can see me trying to come to grips with it. And through the whole of the last 30 years, I have been trying to come to grips with it, to portray futures that kind of recover from it, make a return to leftist ideas of solidarity and mutual aid, et cetera, and tell those stories as a kind of counterforce. So it definitely has been the it's been 40 years, and so in these last 40 years I've been trying to articulate an alternative vision, and so it's definitely been a motivating force.
I think when I think about a lot of popular culture, science fiction, in those stories, the capitalists tend to be the bad guys, and they highlight a lot of these neoliberalist evils in the stories. And I just wondered, do you think that science fiction as a genre is better at telling the stories of of the evils of neoliberalism better than other genres, maybe even better than nonfiction?
Well, science fiction is immensely powerful. I'm a total patriot. First of all, the novel is immensely powerful. Then you set novels in the future, and you've done something complicated. It has to be unpacked aesthetically, and reading protocols. I mean, the science fiction theoretical field is very good on what science fiction is and how it puts demands on readers to play a game that's quite complex, that then you get big rewards out of. But I would also want to say, like, look at my Mars trilogy again. The capitalist William Fort, head of Praxis. These people in my novels, they're not evil.
Mhm.
When you meet them in person, they're perfectly friendly. They're good people. Let's put it that way. In quote marks or not, they a different ideology has allowed them a different view of things. But here's the thing: they've done something legal, so it's the system. You have to focus on the system. Quite good people can use the system that exists and become rich or successful one way or another. Um, that doesn't mean that they're personally evil. And so this is one of the dysfunctions of our time, and it goes right back into the Victorian era. Oh, these snidely whiplashes, these evil rich people who are taking advantage of us. Well, we voted in the system that allowed them to play the game legally and win. So I think they're justified in objecting to this characterization of them. We could vote in a different system where they simply succeeding would mean something different.
Mhm. Well, I think, one of the things I took away from the book was just how human inequality is tied to the health of the planet. And as we've seen, the world has become more equal, the planet has suffered. And I think that what you just said is really interesting because, you know, what is it about human nature do you think allows for such inequality amongst humans in the first place, like what we're seeing today?
Well, I mean, this is a truism on the left that human nature is kind of a ideological construct. We don't know what we're like. It's one of the reasons that I'm fascinated by sociobiology, which gets a bad rap from the left, but inaccurately so. That's a bad reading of what sociobiology can be. What are we as social primates? Well, let's look at the other social primates and let's look at evolutionary history. And how did we get where we are so that we are the major player in the biosphere today? I mean, 98% of the biomass on this planet is humanity and their food animals. And so the wild creatures are 2 or 3% of the biomass on the planet. Well, that's simply terrifying. And you have to look at what we are. Well, we're team players. You know, altruism matters, mutual aid matters. That's how we got where we are. So the whole notion of um, the self-interested person, that you do everything for yourself and your family, that's true, but it's only true up to a point. And we have the usual balance that is philosophical. You got Rousseau versus Hobbes. You have, Marx versus Adam Smith. Do you emphasizing the individual? So then you're studying like a bee, and then you emphasize the society. You're studying the beehive and the fact that the bees are social creatures that have, queens and all of these other social aspects. That means that an individual bee is going to die. And indeed, an individual human, despite Robinson Crusoe, which is another great myth, the individual human is also going to die, maybe after living 80 years, but then they won't have any progeny, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't help to talk about human nature, except to keep a sense that it's both and, not either or. And then you can come to an interesting discussion.
So I think you're saying that it is more the system that has caused this inequality than human nature itself.
Yes, and let's say the system's constructed and indeed is a power play.
Mhm.
And this goes back to the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. Once you get a surplus of goods, then you get a division of labor, and then you get power, and then the few can kick back and tell other people what to do, have a relatively luxurious life relative to the norm, and by the exertion of power, which is comes down eventually to soldiers and army, guns in your face or spears in your face, and sometimes systems of quite draconian control, like fear-based, like do what do what you're told or else you get killed. And then that can shift in modern society to hegemony. You do what you're told because everybody else is, and it seems like the normal thing to do. You don't actually have to have the gun in your face. You do it because it's normal. So all these things need to be discussed. And indeed, the systemic level, once you get to, where we are now, which is sort of representative governments. In other words, in China and the US, citizens feel they're represented by their government. So it's not right to talk about democracy. It's best to talk about representation. And if people think that that's being a little bit, I don't know, un-American or undemocratic, I'll just point out that Chinese citizens will give higher marks to their government than we give to our government. And you could say, oh, well, they're brainwashed and we're not. But, polls are polls. People believe what they believe. And what you want to concentrate on here is that people do feel like their governments represent them with a lot of dissatisfaction all around the world. But wait a second, my government isn't representing me. They're representing the elite 10% international richest people on the planet who are buying the legislators to promote their interests rather than everybody's interests. And at that point, you're back into the political battle.
I read where you consider yourself a democratic socialist. What does that mean to you?
Well, it means that I'm hoping that you could elect a government that would pass laws that would make the public sector bigger, and that the private sector would be confined to the margins of the inessentials. So for me, it would be, called, in China, they would call it state operated enterprises. In America, they would call it public utility districts. or say public school that you go to for free. So we have a sense here of the public and the public good. So what I'm saying is that the necessities of life, food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, and electricity, are all public goods that you shouldn't suffer the lack of. They should be something society provides to every member of that society. So that can be defined as socialism. I'm uneasy with the 19th century big words. So less and less have I been thinking that it's useful to talk about capitalism, socialism. These are such big fuzzy words. Let's talk freedom, let's talk liberty, let's talk love. I mean, what the hell? These are too big. And I'm getting into arguments with people about like wilderness. What's wilderness? Well, wilderness actually has like 10 subcategories once you get to the scientists that are using it as. And so socialism, sure. I'm happy to support it because it's got the right ideas at its heart. But what if we talk about just post-capitalism, or, for instance, the co-op movement, the cooperative principles? If they were applied to capitalism, you'd have a completely different thing than neoliberalism. So I guess as a novelist rather than as a political theorist, I'd like to take it back to individual cases. Well, what about this policy? What about that policy? Without going for we have to have socialism in America or we're all doomed. That just doesn't. That's not resonating for me because it's not practical. Uh, from where we are right now, it doesn't suggest policies that Congress would pass. So I'd like to take it right to the policy by policy level and then dispense with the big words, and historians can use them 200 years from now. We'll see what they say.
I want to talk about American policy a little bit because early in the book you compare the response to deadly climate related natural disasters to school shootings in America. People mourn, they get angry at those enabling, such events to happen. But then anyone that wasn't directly impacted by the event basically moves on until the next one inevitably happens. And the gun problem in America is exponentially easier to solve than the climate crisis, but we're not even close to substantial gun legislation. What do you think that the lack of gun reform and the lack of significant action to combat the climate crisis says about American politics?
Well, we're in a weird bind because we have this constitution that at this point in American political history, it's very, very hard to imagine any amendments coming down the line. So we have to look at that document and work within it. And it's constraining and weird. Um, and the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is one that has legal force. So, okay, we should handguns where you can hide them on your body and then murder other humans, and that's their only point in life. Maybe handguns should be illegal. Many countries make them so, and they don't have the same murder rates as the United States, which is notorious. And then we also have a culture of political violence, a culture of let's talk violently, and talk leads to action especially in minds that have gone off one way or another. And this is a hard world to stay sane in. So you have, I mean, I think I'm just defining what everybody already knows.
Mhm.
It might be that this is actually, I want to try to push back against that comparison and say maybe climate change is easier to solve. Instead of getting into the emotional feeling of, I need to be able to defend me and my family from these awful people, and I'll ignore the evidence that having a gun at home is more dangerous to me rather than less dangerous. I just need my gun because I'm scared of the world. And then there are people out there promoting your fear. That's one situation. Climate change, okay, your children's lives are going to be crap and your grandchildren's lives are going to be crap. We've got a mass extinction event going that is our fault, all of us, including you and me, electricity burn, carbon burn. And what we can do is what we can do is swap out the technology. You can at least put it at first on this basis that if you had everything that you had now, but it was all being supplied by clean energy, Well, that's one big piece. And do you care if your music comes from a cassette player or from a CD player or from Spotify? Do you really care? No, you don't. So decarbonizing the tech base fast, um, it seems to me, is less controversial, especially if it comes to a job guarantee. Suddenly it's your living. Suddenly you've got a prosperous society. Suddenly, even if you own a restaurant, you're feeding people that are putting in the solar panels so that there's a multiplier effect that's very powerful. I think it's much less controversial than something like personal safety and visions of human nature, et cetera.
That does seem less controversial, but we have these solutions today. They're not, they're just not getting enacted. This is clearly a political will problem more so than a technology problem today. In the book, in the scenario that you have forecasted, they're still having these conversations about technologies that exist today, you know, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And Frank, who's one of the main characters of the book, spends a lot of the story, upset by those that say that they're trying, but they're just not producing any tangible results. These are, policymakers. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on policymakers today. Are they intentionally not doing enough to combat the climate crisis and promoting these technologies for maybe nefarious reasons? Or do you think that it is just our political system? Maybe it's the Constitution that you were talking about that just won't allow for such change, thus rendering our policymakers almost powerless.
Well, they're powerful, but they're also bought. So money in politics is critical. And of course, Citizens United and the idea that money equals free speech is a disaster for our politicians actually doing what we elected them to do rather than what the fossil fuel industries are paying them to vote for. So say you're a politician, a senator, or a congressperson, and it it seems to be very intently important to these people to stay in office, to be reelected. It's amazing. The It must be a very addictive drug. This quite limited power of a senator or a representative is enough to completely tweak their minds. You hardly ever see one of them say, I'm going to do what I want. You can elect me or not. And if you don't, I'll go home and I'll make a whole ton more money. But no, power is addictive, and I do believe power corrupts. So you've got you want to get enough votes, but that requires advertising, and there are people that are going to give you many thousands of dollars. Again, I'm describing a situation that we all know already, so I'll dispense with it. You end up voting for the lobbyists that are giving you lots of money, and this is just so flatly bribery and corruption that it's astonishing that we have it going on in front of our eyes and can't seem to do anything about it. But it's part of the political battle. One of the things that the fossil fuel industry and the quote 1% in general pays our legislators to do is to not vote to get their power out of politics. So again, you come back to the political battle. And here, I guess what I'm saying is you just need to play that game hard. You need 51% or you need 55%. Sometimes you need 60%. Maybe you need to get a 51% to say that 60% is too much and say you get rid of the filibuster, et cetera. And so it simply comes back to a wicked political battle to try to steamroll vested interests for the popular will.
The Ministry of the Future describes this post-capitalism society, and I'm very interested because I think what you're saying right now is our political system is so inextricably linked with our economy and with capitalism. I mean, do you think capitalism will survive the 21st century?
Well, again, we're talking about a big word. What if you have a capitalist system in which all of the necessities are public goods, and what if you have a system in which everybody is guaranteed a job with the government as employer of last resort? What if you have progressive taxation such that you can never have a personal fortune of more than, let's say, $10 million. And above that, it's all gone back to the treasury and is part of the general wealth. What if you tax corporations such that the bigger they are, the more they get taxed, and not just income, but assets? And there's no such thing as tax dodges, because all money has been listed and is part of a coding system such that it can't be tucked away and hidden without killing it off entirely. Um, at that point, do you call that capitalism? Um, Now, capitalism is not just capital, because capital is useful stuff. The capital is a kind of a power in the world. Capitalism is the system by which the few get to control it and the many work for the few. So it's the name of a power relationship. That's what capitalism is, the name of a power relationship. If you were to go at it piece by piece and construct what I've just described, which many leftists would scoff at and say, oh, well, you're just a liberal, or you're just a Keynesian, or you're just a co-op member, and you're still in this big, horrible system. But let's take it back to policies. And I don't care anymore. One of the things that I've been saying recently as a science fiction writer and a leftist is arguments on the left are incredibly destructive of the left, but also they are people arguing from different moments of the future. This, I think, is important. It's a new idea for me anyway. If I say we should get rid of the filibuster, this is something that we should do right now. If I say that all people should have an equal amount of power in the political and economic world, like at flat equal all across the board, all humans together. Well, maybe that's the goal for what, 100 years from now, 200 years from now. And then am I an anarchist, or I'm some kind of communist? Okay, but I'm both of those things, depending about whether you're talking about next week or next century. And what people get into on the left, I think, is a wicked argument amongst themselves. Well, it should be like this. Well, it should be like that. One of them's talking from the year 2020, 2200. One of them's talking from the year 2021. And they're arguing bitterly about a stepwise process in history that is actually on the same path. And they like to fantasize in their, and in a good way, their imaginative relationship to history likes to focus on either the near, the midterm, or the far. And then they get in wicked fights about it, when the right, which is just say, hey, the few controls the many, it's always been that way, that's human nature, give me your money, I'm not going to do any, I'm going to get 1,000 times more for what I do, which is pushing paper around and making decisions, than you're going to get for what you do, which is actually feeding people and growing food. Well, this is crap. But their system rules right now, and the people who want to change it are just arguing amongst themselves over a timeline problem. So I would say to all leftists, it's a united front. There's lots of room for taking your specific interests and joining the united front without arguing with other members of your own side, so you don't get into the Spanish Civil War situation.
Yeah, I think an economic theory that kind of follows that, where it is like the next progressive step in the right direction, is modern monetary theory. And I had a chance to talk with Dr. Stephanie Kelton on the Climate Pod about MMT. You describe MMT in the book. Why do you think it's important that people understand modern monetary theory?
Well, I do think it's important. I'm glad you brought it up. I'm loving it, because I think that economists have been ridiculously unhelpful in this situation, because they've stuck with economics, which is an analysis of capitalist normality, capitalist reality. They haven't done political economy, which is just getting back to axioms and talking about the system itself. Modern monetary theory has this advantage. It tries to discuss things in economists' terms, but discussing political economy. And the way that they manage to bridge that fairly big gap is by Keynesianism. My take on it is that modern monetary theory is Keynesianism for our time, and as brought up to date past Keynes's death by paying attention to the way that we've had quantitative easing in the past without blowing apart people's trust in money, teaching us that we can make up, that governments can make up fiat currencies, inject quite a lot of new money into the system, and that money can be targeted for good things. You don't just give it to private banks to continue their ridiculous gambling. You give it to work infrastructure, clean energy projects. You spend it first on decarbonization, so it's called carbon quantitative easing. And MMT also, I'm sure that your doctor, who's been really prominent in making this clear to people, focused on the job guarantee. There are two pillars to MMT. Quantitative easing is okay, and use that new money to pay for a job guarantee for everyone, which is a real blow to the heart of capitalist power, which relies on people's fear. You take a job at a minimum wage that doesn't support you because it's better than nothing at all, and there's 5% of people unemployed always that live in immiseration, and you don't want to get into that category, so you take any job you can get. And so capitalists can pay people less than it costs even to live because it's better than nothing. Well, that, if the government's going to pay you a decent wage for a decent job and give you a decent life, that kills that wage pressure, so called, which is the economics term for it, business um, school term for it. Wage pressure equals fear in the heart of ordinary people. And you take that away with a job guarantee. And the MMT textbooks that I've read always just capitalize it. It's QE or CQE, and it's JG. And these are like the pillars of a bridge from our bad state, the bridge to a better state. And it's relatively reformist. I would say MMT is trying to get back to Keynes, that government has power and needs to exert power for people. And I'm reading a tremendous book on Keynes right now called The Price of Peace,
Yes.
and by Zachary Carter, I think.
Yes.
Um, this is an important book for clarifying what Keynesianism is and how it came about, how it was a response to an emergency situation that in many respects resembles our climate emergency situation, and the solutions kind of worked. And we do need to escape. I mean, with all this talk about politics and economics, I think it's important and crucial, but we do need to escape the mass extinction event. We do need a plan that works in this coming decade. And you mentioned my book talking about the 2030s and 2040s as being still a zone of contestation. I'm sure they will be, but really, Ministry for the Future was written before the pandemic, and it was finished in 2019, at the end of 2019. And since the pandemic, everything has accelerated. And I think that what I wrote about happening in the 2030s, et cetera, is just notional, and it's a part of a science fiction device to estrange the present. Those things are going to happen now. Those things are
Mhm.
happening in this decade, and that's all to the good because we don't have a whole lot of time.
For sure. And I could not agree with you more on all that you said about MMT, as well as Zach Carter in his book. I had Zach on the podcast as well,
Oh,
and
good.
learned so much. I mean, I had a wonderful conversation about Keynes and what that thinking, how that thinking could help us, really apply that thinking to our economics today, our economic policy today. You talk about quantitative easing a lot in the book. That's essential. It's a big part of the book is, the carbon coin.
Mhm.
And you use blockchain to, as the way of introducing and making that carbon coin a success. And I am very interested in that, because I'm not a huge fan of blockchain personally, but I'd love to hear kind of what features of fiat currency do you think that are problematic that blockchain solves?
Yes, and I have to confess that I'm venturing out of my depth, and we're into places where I'll drown. And I'm now regretful that I used the word blockchain in Ministry for the Future, because I wonder if it isn't a kind of a moment in cryptography, and perhaps not end of the story and a kind of fashionable word that will go away as we just talk about money being tagged and coded. So maybe the way um, I really dislike Bitcoin. And of course,
Hmm.
Bitcoin and blockchain are sometimes seen as synonyms for each other. And I've been told by people who know more than I do, who have studied blockchain, and these are, AI and cryptography experts who I run into in the course of my work at conferences, and they say, look, it doesn't have to be this proof of work that burns enormous amounts of carbon like Bitcoin does. That's a invention of Satomi, that the anonymous inventor um, of, of Bitcoin. Well, all that can be dropped. And what you would want is fiat currencies using digital means, using cryptography to tag money so that they know where it goes. And if it was to go into a tax haven, they would know it was there and it would delegitimate it. And so you would have money be tracked. Now, some people immediately object to that and go, oh my God, government control, 1984. But money is part of the social contract, and fiat money is backed by our governments. And if our governments could say to us, we know where your money is, and rich people aren't hiding it in Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, the Grand Caymans, they're and then using it later to be just as rich as anybody else as real money, that money would be delegitimated because they didn't pay their proper taxes in the first place, and you had progressive taxation. So all these things are interlinked in a system where no one piece of the system is the solution. So if you say, "Oh, blockchain's the solution to everything," well, this is crazy. It's like saying cryptography is the solution to everything. Quantum cryptography. Well, no. It exists in an entire weave of laws and methods and technologies that make it more or less useful. So, in short, for Ministry for the Future, I wish I had just said um, trackable money by way of codes, and stayed away from this phrase blockchain, which causes a lot of raised hackles on for different reasons from different
Hmm.
people, and probably it was a mistake. There's quite a few mistakes. I mean, I finished the book in the first month of 2020, and now it's the third month of 2021. I've had 14 months of learning more, and there are things I would do differently in Ministry for the Future.
Well, to change gears, but also I think there is somewhat of a through line here. Geoengineering is brought up a lot in the Ministry for the Future. And, do you think first, do you think geoengineering is going to be required because we won't be able to muster the political will to solve, the climate crisis today or soon enough?
Well, maybe. And I would want to say immediately that geoengineering is one of these words, like capitalism or like blockchain. It immediately raises hackles, and people think they know what is being discussed. So, are we talking about solar radiation management when we say geoengineering? Typically so. And so, solar radiation management, throwing dust into the atmosphere on purpose to deflect some sunlight, maybe 1 or 2% of sunlight off into space from the atmosphere rather than hitting the Earth. Temperatures would cool. Pinatubo, the volcanic eruption of 1991 in the Philippines, is used as a model for what we could do artificially. And now there's discussion of, well, what dust would you put up there? It doesn't have to be as toxic to the ozone layer and to humans as sulfur dioxide, which is what comes out of the earth. It could be limestone dust. So it's being studied as such, and it causes like an allergic reaction among some people. How could we possibly have the hubris to think we could interfere with the Earth's biosystem, which we do daily on a gigantic scale? We are geoengineers, and you can say we have been since the agricultural revolution, but for sure it ramped up, and it's been negative mostly: landscape destruction, habitat loss, the wiping out of most of every species on the planet, and of course the accidental putting of CO2 into the atmosphere. These were all geoengineering efforts. I've been saying to people, if women's education and women's legal rights were secured everywhere on this earth, then we would begin to drop in population, because women, when they have those rights, there's about 1.5 kids per woman. And that population replacement rate, which right now is more like 2.4 for the earth and variable across the planet, depending on women's rights precisely. So we know this to be true by an experiment on ourselves, so that women's rights are a geoengineering technology. At that point, the concept is blown up, and good, because this is one of those words where that's used like a slogan or a bumper sticker. Oh, I've got an opinion on that already. I've got my opinion on nuclear power. I got my opinion on geoengineering. I got my opinion on blockchain. I've got my opinion on democracy versus authoritarianism, et cetera, et cetera. Even government versus business. There aren't that many free marketeers left because it's so obviously a lie. There aren't even that many neoliberals left because they've seen that it has created a huge amounts of damage in the last 40 years. So, but what I'm saying, and maybe this is the novelist's point of view, let's take it back to particulars. What would this thing do? And in geoengineering, in my book, I wanted to propose one that seems like no harm, no foul. You suck the water out from under the big glaciers in Antarctica and Greenland, and it slows them back down to the speed that they were at before. And you might not have massive sea level rise 100 years from now. Well, this one was given to me by glaciologists. They aren't sure it will work. No one's sure because it hasn't been tried, but it seems like it might work. And it's about as inexpensive as solar radiation management, but there's no downside to it. I mean, that water is down there. It's a trivial amount. You could put it into the ocean, or you could put it back up on the ice cap, and no one would even know that it was there. It's such a small amount, but it's the amount that is lubricating the rapid slide of the glaciers into the ocean, where they melt and we get the massive sea level rise. So that's geoengineering, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's just a thing. Electrifying all the cars, that's geoengineering. That's a thing that we're seeing happen way faster than we thought it was going to. And so Paris Agreement is, of course, geoengineering, but at the level of politics and what people do, rather than some kind of silver bullet solution that people are negative about. And I know that one thing people say about geoengineering is, well, listen, it's a moral hazard. If people think we got a technological fix, then we'll just go on with capitalism the way it was going on, and inequality will continue. And yet we will think, oh, well, we've managed the situation. Let's just keep on with the badness that we've got right now. Well, I think that that's a valid argument, but only when you're not in an emergency. If you're in a climate emergency and people are dying of heat waves, you might want to consider cooling temps for 5 years and then thinking it over again. But the situation is so dire, and it has to do with inequality, that now I don't think the moral hazard argument has any force whatsoever. We just maybe we might need it. If we do the other geoengineering well first, we might never throw dust into the atmosphere on purpose. I don't think it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an idea.
Do you think that nations will be able to work together um, to regulate geoengineering in the way that it must be regulated?
Well, let's I mean, again, you're saying, when you say geoengineering, let's say you're saying solar radiation management, this
Yes, let's be
planned,
specific
yeah,
on that one.
tossing
Yeah.
dust, the nations. Well, yes, they're actually convening already to try to talk about when would we do this and how would we decide and how could we make it something that the majority of the citizens of the world are comfortable with us trying. So they're trying to work that out. I said in my novel, if one nation gets hammered by a heat wave and says, we're doing this on our own and it'll have global implications, but to hell with you because we need it and you laid it on us. If it's a tropical nation, India, Indonesia, Brazil, if one of those heat waves hits around the tropics and a big populous nation says, we have to do this to save our citizens, the rest of the world will have no moral force and no physical force to stop them. That said, they're working on it right now, and the platform is the Paris Agreement, which means the International Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC. I always get that intergovernmental panel, and then it means the UN. So we have a international treaty system and discussion format, which is the UN, and that's how it'll get worked out.
Mhm. Well, change subjects again a little bit. There's a lot of violence and in the ministry for the future. And it is used as a way to achieve goals that many may not believe are possible under our current political system. And you refer to this as the war for the world in the book. How do you think the climate crisis is going to lead to more violence?
Well, I don't know. There's slow violence. This is a very useful term of Rob Nixon's. the the system as it exists has got 1 billion people on this planet immiserated right now. So there is violence. And some of those people get angry enough when they watch their family die, to take arms. And then they can be violent in ways that are completely useless to them, their family, their cause. Spasms of reactive vengefulness. So intelligent, targeted violence is quite rare. And what I wrote about in Ministry for the Future is that if we don't cope with the problems by way of the discursive battle, then there are going to be people mad enough to become what the ruling powers will call terrorism, what the immiserated will call resistance fighters. So the war for the earth will become physical, and asymmetric warfare is very, very easy. Doesn't even have to be suicide bombers, although there are people angry enough to do that, as we've seen. But it could be that you don't have to sacrifice your life to do an enormous amount of damage. And now there's a big distinction being made, which the ministry, my novel, does not make well enough, between property damage and violence against people. So, like Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, this is not a guidebook as to how to blow up a pipeline. This is the argument of, is violence against property that's going to damage future generations justified? It's a philosophical book. So these arguments are coming up. And in my book, it's quite confused, although I believe that's a good model for how it's going to feel. History is quite confused. It isn't just a place of clear arguments winning one way or another. But let's go back to your question and say, a lot of people believe we aren't going to act fast enough. Why do they say that? That's capitalist realism. That's hegemony. If there was an election like in 2022, where the American government got a really strong progressive hold and began to do like New Deal style legislation in flurries that change American reality, say MMT's goal of quantitative easing and a job guarantee based on green infrastructure starts to roll, what's to stop it from continuing to roll? And so there's this immediate, I would say, fashionable cynicism. Like, it's easier to say, oh, well, I've read all the books, I understand the world, we're screwed. And so that fashionable pessimism, cynicism, is part of giving upness. It's what Michael Mann calls doomism in his new book. It's easier to just say, well, we're doomed, let's party on, I'm just going to live on, than it is to engage in the struggle of our time. And so I would just challenge that assumption in the first place. We're not actually doomed. We could actually make a good future. So, and it's not exactly magic either. It's not like we need technology X, the new thing. It's all stuff we already have, everything except for um, the the economic system that pays ourselves to do the right work in a way that everybody trusts is real money being paid for real work, and then the politics to make that happen. So that's why my novel focused on that aspect of things.
Another idea from the novel is that the fear of change is holding people back. And do you think that the necessary changes for a sustainable planet are just too big for the majority of people? Are we just too afraid of change?
Good question, and not a trivial question, because I'm convinced that we are afraid of change inherently as living creatures. So, okay, you're alive, but it's kind of like a whirlwind, a dust devil, or a gigantic collaboration, like um, a bunch of acrobats on a tightrope, on a bicycle on a tightrope with a bunch of acrobats on one of the balancing bars. That's you. That's me, alive. So it's going well. It's a dynamic system. You're still alive, but it's going to fall apart and you're going to die at some point as a physical creature. So change can easily psychologically equate to it can only go downhill from here, because over the long stretch of your life, it is going to go downhill. So it's a realistic assessment. Now, history itself is a different story, and change in history happens all the time. So you want stability, and stability equals goodness, and then change equals death. So which are you going to choose? Well, I mean, we have a natural inclination to choose stability and keep things the way they are so that you're still alive. So there's an interference pattern between your individual fate as a moral creature and history as a process that will go on after your death and include your children and your grandchildren. That's why I called it the ministry for the future. Can we think forward well enough to incorporate the people that will come after us as part of our consideration of what we do now? And I think that in a way, this is the reassurance. This is the way, if you're a secular person, if you don't believe in an afterlife for yourself personally, and you're going to die, well, you can comfort yourself with the idea that you've been part of a process where things go better for your species and for your biosphere. So that, I think, is the work of our time, is cranking that engine, that empathy, sympathy for future generations and for the other creatures on the planet. And that can be your comfort for your own individual demise. And then you have to embrace change, because we're in a very bad situation and massive change is necessary to squeak out of it.
Well, for anyone that wants a glimpse of what the world might look like if we continue with the status quo and we don't change, we don't take the rapid and substantial steps toward combating the climate crisis, then please go out and get the Ministry for the Future. Absolutely fascinating book and just a great look at what our future might be. I hope it's not, but it will definitely make you want to go and do everything in your power to stop that from happening. So we will link to the Ministry of the Future in our show notes. Anything else before we
Well,
go?
I just want to say Ministry for the Future is a best case scenario. It's a utopian novel. It is not it begins with the badness of our situation that we are already in. So it isn't as if I'm making anything up or having to crank the years forward. Um, but what it shows is that even in the badness of the situation that we are already in, we could get to the best case scenario is not bad. Is That's really the utopian horizon has shrunk from let's have a perfect society to let's dodge a mass extinction event and then see where we can go from there. So that's what ministry is like. And so I would not want to have you propose to the audience that this is a book to scare you with dystopia. It's actually a book about how we might dodge dystopia.
Maybe the scary part is the path to that utopian future.
Yeah, there's going to be it's going to be chaotic for young people like yourself and probably most of your listeners. The entire rest of your life is going to be this topic that your pod is about. This crisis. This It isn't like we're going to solve it and then you're going to be in happy land. Even if you live a full life, live 100 years. At the end of the 100 years, you'll be in the year 2100 or whatever, and the story won't be over, and it'll still be this will be the big story. So it's kind of depressing, but it's also it's a project. It's, in other words, it's something to organize your life around. It's a project, and everybody needs a project. So it's going to be messy.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, Kim Stanley Robinson, thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you, Ty. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.